Right, good morning. Let's begin. It's an interesting topic that we're going to explore today, a topic perhaps that comes up more frequently than we'd give it credit for, or maybe it should come up more often. Question today is it naive to always look for the good in other people? Of course, it's very nice, right? Everybody, certainly if you're on the receiving end, you want people to look at you from a positive perspective and to see the good in you. But is it realistic? Is it fair? Is it something that we could rely upon? You know, that's actually
recording in progress.
Is it something that we could rely on as a meaningful concept within Judaism? So that's what we're going to have a look at today. And as a result of that, we'll learn some very intriguing perspectives on how we are supposed to look at the next person. So I'll tell you how we're going to do this. We're going to start, our whole conversation is going to be built on differences of opinion of Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. So therefore, we're going to actually start with a story that involved the two originals. Remember, Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai are two schools. And those schools were built around two great sages, Hillel and Shammai. So we're actually going to start at the core, we're going to start at the source, with a story of Hillel himself and a story of Shammai himself. In fact, three stories. Everybody's familiar with the one story. So we're going to look at these three stories. They are very similar. They carry a similar theme. We're also then going to look at a very famous debate between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, that's the two yeshivas, about how you speak to people. And then we'll try to develop, unpack, and drill down into these various stories to understand what really is the message behind them all. So let's start at the beginning with the story that everybody is very familiar with. Only, like I say, it's one of three stories. So the one that we're very familiar with is, as the Gemara presents it, the second one of the stories. So the story goes as follows. There was an individual who was a prospective convert to Judaism, a prospective ger, and he wanted to know, what does it take in order to become Jewish? So he came to the great sage Shammai. Shammai, of course, the head of a very successful yeshiva, one of the most recognized scholars in the early Mishnah period. And this prospective convert comes to Shammai and he says, would you accept me as a ger, as a convert to Judaism, on condition that I only commit myself to the written Torah, the Torah Shebechsav? Now, if you're familiar, of course, with history, you'll know that that became a very contentious issue later on in Jewish history. Not much later, actually, after Shammai and Hillel, where there was a breakaway group of people who called themselves the Baitusim, or they called themselves the Tzedukim, because they had two leaders. One was called Sadok and one was called Baitos. And the premise of their entire rebellion and rejection of Judaism was that they only believed in the written Torah, scriptures, and they were unwilling to accept the oral tradition. So here's a man who approaches Shammai and he says to Shammai, I'd like to become Jewish on condition that I only accept the Torah Shebechsav, the written Torah. Shammai says, what are you talking about? Get out of here. Not interested. It's a non-starter. Judaism is a package deal. Nothing to discuss. Off you go. Now, the same convert then goes down the road to the other yeshiva, because you know that's how it always happens. If you don't get the answer that you were looking for from one rabbi, so what do? You find another rabbi. And I'm sure there's an app for that. You punch in the answer that you'd like to get, and then they tell you which rabbi to approach with your question. So now the fellow goes down the road to another great yeshiva, the yeshiva of Hillel, and he says to Hillel, can you teach me can you accept me as a convert on condition that I only commit myself to scriptures, to the written Torah? And Hillel says, by all means, come inside, let's explore. I'll tell you all about our conversion program. That's story number one. Story number two is the one that's very famous. A prospective convert arrives at the door of Shammai's yeshiva and he says to Shammai, teach me the whole Torah as I stand here on one foot. You know the story. You've heard the story multiple times. Teach me the whole Torah as I stand here on one foot. And the Gemara says at that point, Shammai takes what's called Amas Habinyan, which is effectively a long stick that was used for measuring construction sites. And he waves it at him and he says, get lost. Nothing to discuss. What do you think this is? Some kind of a game? You think Judaism is a download? Forget about it. I cannot tell you the depth and complexity of Judaism as you stand here on one foot. So he obviously learned from the first guy. He also goes down the road, and he also goes to Hillel himself, and he says to Hillel, would you teach me the whole Torah as I stand here on one foot? And Hillel says to him, without batting an eyelid, Ma da'aloch soni lechavrach lo yisavid, that what is hateful to you, don't do to somebody else. And the rest, v'idach pirushahu, the rest is commentary, zil gemara, go study. And the third scenario is another prospective convert who comes to Shammai, and he says, would you accept me as a convert and then allow me the opportunity down the line to become the Kohen Gadol? Can you imagine? Not only does he want to be accepted to the club, he wants to become the head, he wants to become the most prominent individual in the community. So will you accept me as a convert and then allow me to go through a process and eventually become the Kohen Gadol? Shammai says to him, what are you talking about, Kohen Gadol? A Kohen is not a voluntary position. A Kohen is an inherited position. There's nothing to discuss. Not only could you not become the Kohen Gadol, you can't even become an ordinary Kohen. It's not on the agenda. It's not available to you. Goodbye. So he goes down the road to Hillel. Says, I want to become a convert in order that I should become the Kohen Gadol. And Hillel says, okay, let's talk about this. Let's investigate. What exactly are you interested in? Why is the Kohen Gadol so exciting for you, etc.? And he accepts him as a convert. So you can clearly see that the theme through all of three of these stories sounds like Shammai is a hardliner, and there's no negotiation. Life is black and white. And so therefore, when people come with nonsense and it doesn't exactly fit into the way that Judaism should operate, off you go. Whereas Hillel is apparently more tolerant and accepting, and he allows a little bit of flexibility, and he invites people through the door. Now, if we are going to understand that story in that way, we have a very serious issue that we have to contend with. Because we know, number one, there is no such thing. It's unacceptable. You cannot enter Judaism with a set of your own conditions. Who do you think you are? You're going to approach Judaism, which we know is God-given, and start to dictate the details of how it's going to work. I'll become Jewish if I don't have to conform to... Sorry, these are the rules of the club. If you would like to be part of the club, you have to adhere to the rules. So how's Hillel entertaining the possibility of, okay, here's a guy who only wants to keep the Torah Shebichsav, the written Torah, bring him through the door. Shammai says you cannot summarize the whole of Judaism in a single line. He's right, you cannot. It's not possible. So what's Hillel doing? And Hillel, at the end of the day, doesn't even actually summarize the whole of Judaism. He tells him there's a lot more, idach pirusha, there's a lot more of commentary, zil gemara, you better go and study and explore further. And the third story, the guy who says he wants to become a Kohen Gadol, where Hillel's leading him on. He's telling him, come, let's talk about this. He should have told him straight. He should have been honest with him. He should have leveled with him. This is not an option. I cannot become a Kohen Gadol. There, it's not offensive. It's not something that discriminates against you. I cannot become a Kohen Gadol because I'm not from that family. I don't have that lineage. Why does he invite him in for a conversation in the first place? I guess it leads to another question. What's better in life? Is it better to be direct and honest with people? Because that seems to be the approach of Shammai. Or is it better to make people feel good? Because that seems to be the approach of Hillel. The only problem is, if you're making somebody feel good, is that possibly dishonest? I mean, it's a nice thing to do and all, and it feels accommodating to the recipient. But at the end of the day, is it not fundamentally dishonest? And at the end of the day, is it not going to just hurt them down the line? So Hillel takes this guy in under the pretense that perhaps one day he could become the Kohen Gadol. And maybe the guy now enrolls in the yeshiva and goes through the conversion process. And then down the line, it turns out that that's actually not even an option. And then he's really hurt. Hillel, you misled me. How did you allow me into this place, into this situation in the first place? So there's got to be more, of course, to their two perspectives. And once we understand what lies behind their perspectives, to give us a tremendous insight into how we're supposed to look at other people. So let's take the other story. It's not a Hillel Shammai story, it's a base Hillel, base Shammai story. The Gemara talks about the notion of, well, it's actually a Mishnah, talks about weddings. Everybody likes to go to a wedding, of course. And one of the uncomfortable things in a wedding, if we're honest about it, is the speeches. Why the speech is uncomfortable? It depends which wedding you're at. Sometimes the speeches are uncomfortable because they're inappropriate and they say things that make us feel awkward. And other times the speeches at the wedding are uncomfortable because they're too gushing and it's so rosy tinted. Everything is amazing and you're the most wonderful person. And we all know that life is not that straightforward. And we all know that somewhere down the line there will be some kind of tension or kind of obstacles that these people are going to have to work their way through. So how realistic are these speeches? You're the most amazing person and so on. But besides the speeches, when you go over to wish Mazel Tov, as we do, right? We go over to the person to wish Mazel Tov. And particularly when you go to the chassan, to the groom, to wish Mazel Tov, what are you supposed to say? It's subject to a debate, a very famous debate between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. According to Beis Shammai, Kala kemois shehi. Whatever you have to say to the groom about his new bride has to be brutally honest. So, if she's not the prettiest girl around, don't say, wow, you married a beauty. Don't say that. Kala kemois shehi. Find a nice way to give a compliment that doesn't fudge the reality. Beis Hillel say to Beis Shammai, so what are you going to do? What happens if she is blind? What happens if she is a cripple? Now, obviously, this person has chosen to marry this woman. That means that he sees beyond her disability. So what are you going to do now? Bring it up in his face? Say, she's obviously a wonderful person for someone with a disability. So Beis Hillel say, the nature of people is that when a person goes to the shops and they buy something and they come back and they tell you about their purchase, the correct approach is to say, wow. That's how you should react. They went, they chose, they invested, they came home, they believe that they've made a good choice. Shkoyach. Wow. Make them feel good about it. And using a similar logic, Beis Hillel say, when you go to the chassan and you tell him what you think about having met his wife, you always say, Kala no'a v'chasuda. That she is a beautiful bride and she is a kind bride. She's a person who obviously has good traits, good nature. So it's a fascinating debate. Again, it's around the same concept. Should you be honest with people? Like Shammai says, listen, you're never going to be a Kohen Gadol. Goodbye, don't waste your time over here. Or when you tell the person, I think your wife has wonderful character, which effectively might be a way of saying, I don't think that she's necessarily the most good-looking person. Versus Beis Hillel, that seems to go with a view of, be accommodating, invite people through the door, make them feel good. Yes, we'll see what we can do about becoming a Kohen Gadol. Let's discuss it. First, there's 3 years of conversion to go through. Or, like the person who goes over to the groom and says, wow, the most wonderful person ever. What an amazing, beautiful bride. Now, you have to ask yourself a core question over here. We know that the Torah tells us, it's a verse in the Torah, we've just read it, midvar sheker tirchak. That it's an obligation for us as Jewish people, not only not to lie. That it says as well, elsewhere in the Torah. It says, lo shakrun, that you shouldn't lie. But the Torah says more than that. Midvar sheker tirchak. From even a word that is dishonest, you need to distance yourself. Stay away from dishonesty, almost as if to say to the nth degree. So what's Beis Hillel doing? Is this not sheker? Is this not borderline false? Hillel says to the guy, hey, it's okay, you want to become a Kohen Gadol? All right, let's talk. Midvar sheker tirchak. Stay far away from anything that could be misconstrued as dishonest. And that could be misconstrued as dishonest. Beis Hillel say, tell the guy he's got the most wonderful bride. Maybe that's not the case. Maybe you actually feel bad for him that he made a poor choice. It's an ill-suited shidduch. Maybe you don't believe that the shidduch is going to last. Why are you saying Kala no'a v'chasuda? That this is the most beautiful woman. Midvar sheker tirchak. Stay far from anything that is untrue. And by extension, let's turn this into a conversation about ourselves. when we engage with other people, when we interact with other people. So sometimes we say things that we don't necessarily mean. And not because we're bad, not because we're dishonest, not because we're looking to kiss up to people. Sometimes we feel that maybe if I speak positively, or maybe if I focus on what's good about the person, maybe it will help, or maybe at the very least it will make me feel better. So let's say that there's a person who disappoints me in this particular area of life, and we'll all have people like that. Let me focus instead of the areas where they are successful. Let me focus rather on something that they've done well. Now, it might be easier. It might feel better. Maybe it will even inspire them to some extent that they should live up to the accolades that you're giving them. But doesn't the Torah want us to be honest? Doesn't the Torah expect us that the way that we are going to deal with other people should be with integrity? Now, this is really important because in today's world, there's all kinds of thoughts around, positive reinforcement. You can do anything, the motivational speakers, the people that tell you how amazing you are. And perhaps there's quite a lot of letdown after that, If you grow up your whole life and everybody tells you you can conquer the world and you can do anything and you can achieve anything, and then you don't, it's far more disappointing than if you grew up in the school of hard knocks where they told you straight, you are never going to be an A student. So get on with it. Do something else. Find your niche. So it's quite an important balance to try and understand how to achieve. Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, and of course their respective leaders, Hillel and Shammai themselves, are people of incredible insight. They are so deep and they are so profound in their thinking that they'll help us through this particular way of how we should interact with people. The only thing is that very often, and this is a general rule in Judaism, you cannot look at a particular situation in isolation and think that based on that particular situation, you're going to be able to extrapolate to how you should live all areas of life. Instead, what we always are challenged to do is to find a way to see a theme. So that, for example, it's always a dangerous thing to do, to say, okay, I found one place in the Torah that teaches a particular principle, so that must then be a principle of the whole of Judaism. Who knows? Maybe that was a very isolated incident, and in those very specific circumstances, that philosophy applies. But if I want to know how I'm supposed to think as a Jewish person, in this case, if I want to know what Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai think about how you relate to other people, it'd be very worthwhile for me to look at other areas where Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai disagree about things, because that will help us to understand their views, their respective views. And once we understand their respective views, it makes a massive difference to understanding what they're trying to teach us about how you're supposed to look at people. And based on that, obviously, which of their two views should be the one that we actually focus on. So there are many, many places right across the whole of the Mishnah where Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai argue about a whole host of different things. We're going to focus on just a few of them because they relate to the conversation of what we're going to have today. So let's have a look. Here's one example. Now, it's quite involved, and the objective of this shir is not necessarily to get into all the halachic layers of this particular story. So I'm not going to get into every single layer. I just want to extract one point from this particular debate because it's relevant to our conversation. The debate is that we know that the laws of tumah, the laws of impurity, mean that something which is impure that comes into contact with certain items or food or people can transmit impurity and contaminate those things. So let's start at the beginning of this particular scenario. If you've got a book, can a book become impure? Now, when I'm talking about a book, it's specifically a Torah book, right? When the Torah speaks about, or let's say more correctly, let's say you have a Torah scroll. Now, we know that the words of Torah can never become contaminated, but can the actual physical scroll become contaminated? And the answer to that is, well, there's a rabbinic thing where we consider Sfarim to be impure because we don't want people to put them anywhere near food, because then that would attract rodents and the rodents would eat the scrolls. So there is room to excuse the scrolls that they could never become impure. But the scrolls are covered. right? You go to shul, the Torah has a cover on it. Now we've got to assess the cover of the Torah scroll can definitely become impure because it falls into the category of clothing, and clothing or any material that is used can become impure. Beis Shammai says that's the bottom line. It's impure and that's it. Beis Hillel says, well, it actually depends. If it has fancy embroidery on it, then it won't become impure. Now you've got to ask yourself the question, what's the difference if it has fancy embroidery or if it doesn't have fancy embroidery? So Beis Hillel argues like this. There are two possibilities of why you would cover a Torah. The one possibility, which is the most logical possibility, is to protect it. Now the law is that if an item is used as a container or to protect something that goes inside it, then it is susceptible to become impure. But there's another reason you might put a cover on a Torah. When you go to shul and you look at the cover of the Torah, what do you see? Wow, it's so pretty. They've chosen a beautiful velvet. They've got this design on it. They've put words on the Torah. If you look at it, there's a sense of beauty. Now, if it's there to give beauty to the Torah, that's going to change its status. And it's now not just simply a protective cover, but it's actually part of the beauty of the Torah, and that will relieve it from becoming impure. Now, you might wonder at this point in time, what on earth does that have to do with our conversation? It's completely unrelated, but it has a very important part to do with our conversation. And in order to understand the part that it has to do with our conversation, let's look at another example. Now, in this particular case, the Mishnah doesn't actually refer to Beis Hillel and to Beis Shammai. Rather, it refers to Rabbi Eliezer and the sages. But Rabbi Eliezer was a student of the Shammai yeshiva, so it is effectively a debate between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Now, this might get a little complex. I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. 3 times a year, there was a massive migration because you had to go on pilgrimage to Yerushalayim. You had to go to the Beis HaMikdash. And, of course, the people who came to the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, it was a big deal. It wasn't just that you came and you brought some sacrifices and you davened together with a minyan. It was this major tourist event of the year as well. And you know what it's like. You go to Israel and you go to the Koisel. You go to the Western Wall. You don't just go to the Western Wall. You explore it. You look around. If you've never been there before, you might go do the tunnel tour because you want to understand the historical context. You want to understand the archaeological context. It's very interesting. Let's say, lahavdil, that a person would travel to Washington, D.C. So you go to Washington, you sign up to go on a tour of the White House because you want to see, this is the Oval Office and this is the Blue Room. It's interesting. So lahavdil, in a similar way, when people would come to the Beis HaMikdash for Pesach and Shavuos and Sukkot, there were tours. Not classical tours where they took them around the various places, but the Kohanim would show them different things of the Beis HaMikdash so they could appreciate what was going on. Even to the extent that we're told they used to pull back the curtain, so you were standing at a distance away, but you could see temporarily into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, into the Holy of Holies. Nobody's allowed in, but you're allowed to see it from a distance. And they would show them, this is the menorah. Remember, everything is portable. So they would bring out the vessels and they would show them, this is this and this is that and whatever. So because there were so many people there, and you can well imagine not everybody there was an expert in halacha. So not everybody knew the nuances of the laws of purity and impurity because they are very involved and very complex laws. So you could imagine that with the masses of people who were there, the likelihood was that somebody who was impure would have touched some of the vessels that had been brought out onto display. Therefore, the halacha is that any vessel that was brought into the public space over the course of Yom Tov had to be dipped in a mikveh after Yom Tov in order to make it pure again, with 2 exceptions. And thank God for the one exception, because the actual utensil is so massive, you couldn't put it in a mikveh. The 2 exceptions are the 2 altars, the 2 mizbachos. One is the golden altar that sat indoors and was quite small, so it's possible that they could have actually brought it out and put it on display. And the other is called the Mizbeach HaNechoshes, the so-called copper altar, which sat outside in the courtyard, and at least in the time of the Mishkan, was coated in, not only in the time of the Mishkan, it was coated with copper. So it's very clear, everybody agrees that those two implements don't have to be toivel. They don't have to go into a mikveh. Even if people would have touched them. The question is, why? So there are two opinions. There's Rabbi Eliezer, who is a student of Beis Shammai, and he says, why? Because if you read the Torah makes it very clear that both of those altars have the status of earth. Okay, so let's backtrack for a second. What kind of materials could become impure? Metal, clay, glass, at least Rabbanan, if not from the Torah, wood, except for very large wooden items that you typically don't move. So, for example, if you had a massive storeroom built out of wood, even if it had no roof, so it looks like a vessel, if it's not going to be moved, we just assume that it cannot become impure. But generally, wood does become impure. Earth, the actual soil itself, cannot become impure. So because the Torah tells us that both of these altars are considered like earth, that's why they're not impure. That's according to Rabbi Eliezer, who is a student of Beis Shammai. According to the other sages, who typically would follow Beis Hillel's view, because generally we follow Beis Hillel's view on most areas of Jewish law. According to the rabbis, the Rabbanan, the reason is because they have a metal coating on the outside. That's why they're not impure. Because they have a metal coating. In the one case, it's gold, and in the other case, it's copper. That's why they're not impure, which raises a whole storm of different questions in the Gemara. What do you mean? Metal is a classic conductor of impurity. What do you mean? Because it's got metal, that's why it's not impure. That makes no sense. And after a fair amount of analysis, the conclusion is this. It's because the metal is only a coating. It's not the actual structure. In other words, the structure is made of stone or of earth. And then it's got this thin coating on the outside, which is either gold or copper, as the case may be. So now you've got to ask yourself, the metal is not there for the metal's sake. The metal is there to service the temple, the altar. So it loses, this is critical information, it loses its status of being metal because it is secondary, as we say in the language of halacha, it is tofel, it is secondary to the container, like the tapestry on the cover of the Torah. It's there to beautify the Torah, so we don't see it as independent, we see it as part of the Torah. The gold or the copper is there to beautify the altar, so we don't see it as separate and therefore a metal instrument that can become impure. We see it as part of the bigger picture. In these two scenarios, the scroll and the Mizbeach, we get to appreciate the big difference between Beis Shammai thinking and Beis Hillel thinking. Beis Shammai thinking is, whenever you're presented with a scenario, whether it be a halachic scenario, whether it be a human scenario, the correct way to approach it is first see what strikes you. You know, where we have a principle in Judaism that says, Ein ledayan ela ma she'ein of royos, which means that a judge can only judge based on what he sees with his eyes. So Beis Shammai effectively develops that principle and says, so what do you see? When you look at the altar, what do you see? You see gold. Well, gold's a problem. Gold could become impure. Or you see copper. Copper is a problem. Copper could become impure. So therefore, the only way that we could ensure that the Mizbeach does not become impure is we need the Torah to inform us that in spite of what you're seeing, because you're seeing gold and you're seeing copper, the Torah informs us in spite of that, we consider this like earth. Beis Shammai says, you look at the cover of the Torah, what do you see? You see a cover that is made out of material, and material can become impure. So that's it. It is impure. End of story. Now, Beis Hillel takes a different view. Beis Hillel says the correct way that we're supposed to look at any scenario is we're supposed to explore the context and the details of the scenario. So I look at the Mizbeach and I see gold. That's not enough. I can't stop there. I've got to explore further. Okay, so it's gold. Why is there gold? How much gold is there? What else is there besides the gold? And then I discover that the gold is only a thin coating on the outside. And I discover that what else there is besides the gold is a mizbeach made of material that cannot become impure. And I then realize that the purpose of the gold is just to service the mizbeach. So I'm no longer just looking at how things appear. I'm delving deeper. And when I delve deeper, I discover context. And when I have context, I don't need a verse from the Torah to tell me that this is not impure. I can see logically that it's not impure. It makes sense that it's not impure because the metal is not playing the role of metal. It's playing the role of a coating to an item that cannot become impure. Same thing. I look at the cover of the Torah. I don't just see a cover. Let me analyze it. This cover of the Torah, is it just simply a protective thing? Let's have a look. No, it's got all this beautiful tapestry on it. Okay, so that tells me something. That tells me its job is not just simply to protect. Its job is also to show beauty. This is critical information for us. That tells us that the Shammai world always makes decisions based on how things appear at face value. The Hillel world always looks to see, can we find more to the story? So a person walks into Shammai's office, says, I would like to become a convert without committing to the oral Torah. Shammai's approach is, at face value, what am I seeing? Somebody who's not in boots and all. Sorry, that doesn't work. You cannot become a convert to Judaism if you're rejecting part of Judaism. I'm sorry, I cannot accept you because what meets the eye is a person who's not willing to fully commit. The same man walks into Hillel's office. Hillel says, let's do a psychoanalysis of this person. Why would a person make such a comment that they want to commit to Judaism? So that tells you something. They're obviously interested in Judaism. And then they're putting in conditions which tells you what? Hillel says, let's examine. Let's take the guy in, spend some time with him, and see what emerges. Let's learn about him. Is he a wacko? Is he just looking for an easy way to become part of the Jewish community without commitment? Well, in that case, we'll get rid of him. But if over the course of time we realize that he's just simply misguided and he doesn't understand what the oral Torah is, and he's actually willing to commit once we educate him, well, then that's great. Let's pull him along. And the same thing applies to the other two scenarios. Shammai sees at face value a guy is playing games. You want to stand on one foot and get the whole Torah. Please, that's nonsense. Hillel says this is a person who's trying to understand what is the core of Judaism. What's it all about? So in context, that's actually very positive for a prospective convert. He wants to get to the depth of what makes Judaism Jewish. And then obviously based on that, he'll either commit or he'll say it's not for him. So engage him. Or the guy comes into Shammai's office and says, I want to be a Kohen Gadol. And Shammai says, that's not possible. We can't do that for you. Goodbye. And Hillel says, one second, let's understand. Why would a person be motivated to become a Kohen Gadol? What does that tell you about the person? Is it because he's an egoist and he just wants to become a control freak? Or is this somebody who has an incredible sense of aspiration to spirituality? So if that's the case, he'd be a brilliant prospect for becoming Jewish. Let's bring him in. Now, it's interesting because names in Judaism are always very carefully chosen. So Shammai and Hillel, their names actually tell us about their approach. Shammai, the root of his name is the word sham, which means to measure, as the expression goes. Hasham or choisav. It's actually a verse that a person measures their steps. That's Shammai's world. Everything has to be measured. That's why when he chases the guy out, he takes the measuring stick, because that's the message he wants to show him. Things need to fit into a particular order, and they have to fit into a particular structure and hierarchy, and there's no shortcuts. So Hasham or choisav. As far as Shammai is concerned, we always have to look for the ultimate goal, the ultimate commitment, the ultimate perfection. And sometimes in order to do that, we have to look at things as they present themselves and create a standard. Do they fit that standard or not? Hillel, the word Hillel is related to the pasuk in Eov that says Behilu Neroi, which means the light shone. Hillel's job is, or approach in Judaism is, let's shine light on the scenario. Let's always try to find something which is positive in the scenario that may not necessarily meet the eye, that won't neatly fit into a structure or a set of boxes. So for that, we're going to have to look deeper. But we're going to have to look not just deeper, because unfortunately, sometimes when you look deeper, you dig up all the dirt on something or on someone. Hillel says we've got to look with light. We've got to take an approach which says, how do we look to illuminate a scenario that maybe at face value does not seem to be so bright? And that's why Hillel's attitude is, invite the ger in and let's see if we can find the light inside of them. Now, all of that will come right back to the conversation about how you look at other people. Remember that Hillel and Shammai, Hillel is relatable to our world. That's why in 90% of cases, we follow Hillel or base Hillel's rules. Whereas Shammai is this idealist who sees how the world will be in a perfect state. One day when Moshiach comes, then we'll be able to live at the Shammai level of expectation. So Hillel says, Kala no'a v'chasuda. Yes, of course, they're talking about when you go to a wedding and how do you interact with the bride and with the groom. Of course, that's what they're talking about. But nothing in Judaism is one layer only. And we know very well that throughout the whole of Judaism, bride and groom is metaphoric for Hashem and us. Hashem is the groom, we are his bride. Now, sometimes you look at us and you say, Kalla kemois shehi. If you had to ask Beis Shammai, how do you rate a person from a Jewish or spiritual perspective? Shammai says, call it as you see it. This person is not necessarily doing that particular mitzvah. It's not a judgment, it's a fact. They're not performing that mitzvah. I love this person, but they don't keep Shabbos. So the reality is that in their relationship with their groom, kemois shehi, they might have a bit of a disability. They're not necessarily the healthiest bride that I've ever seen. That's the facts on the ground. That's the reality of how you look at a person. There is no hiding it. It isn't a judgmental statement. It is a factual statement. But Hillel is Behilu Nero. One second, let's shine a light over here. Let's look a little bit deeper. Let's look at the context. What is the context of a husband and wife? And it's very interesting how Beis Hillel illustrate this point by making what seems to be an inappropriate reference. They say, when a person goes to the shop and buys merchandise, really, you're comparing a wife to merchandise? Yes, we're comparing the psychology. Because everybody knows, and we've experienced this ourselves, that when you buy something, you become quite attached to it. And the last thing you want is for somebody to criticize, because at the end of the day, you made the choice to purchase that particular item. It's not as if it was a gift. Yes, sometimes you've got to wear that sweater that your grandmother gave you for Hanukkah, and you don't really like it, but you've got to wear it. But this is a purchase. That means I did this of my own volition. I did the research. I made the commitment. So therefore, it's more than just my item. It's actually a judgment of me as a person. It's a similar thing with marriage. I chose this person. I spent time with them. I got to know them. And I decided that this is the right person for me to spend the rest of my life with. Now you look at your next fellow Jew. You say, Kalo kamoi shehi in Beis Shammai's perspective. Let's call it as we see it. This is a person who's not quite as they should be. Says Hillel, that's true, but who chose to marry them? Who chose that this should be the bride? Did they put up their hand and say, pick me? Hey, God, you're looking for a partner. I'll be your person. And then they let Hashem down? No, it's not how it worked. You read the parasha about the giving of the Torah. Hashem says clearly, Atem tiyu li, you will be for me. Mamleches kohanim v'goy kadosh, a nation of kings and a holy people. You chose us. Now, why does a person choose to marry somebody, to buy an item? Well, unfortunately, they have limited insight and limited knowledge of the particular situation. And based on the best of their investigation, that's what they choose. Hashem doesn't have those limitations. If Hashem chooses that this is the person he wants as his bride, that's the best possible choice. It couldn't have been better. So what's Beis Hillel saying? Look beyond what meets the eye. The Jew is not the sum of their behavior. There is a deep Jew inside, in spite of that behavior. Or to put it into the language of the other conversation, the Jew is not the coating on the outside. Yes, the coating could become impure. That's possible. The coating could at some time be contaminated. Gold could be contaminated. Copper could be contaminated. But once you know who that is, once you know that that gold belongs to an altar, a place of sacrifice to Hashem, then you recognize that in spite of the external contamination on the inside, in essence, this person is absolutely dedicated to Hashem at all times. In fact, not long after the conversation about Rabbi Eliezer and the Rabbanan debating why it is that the altar does not become impure, the Gemara makes a very interesting comment. And the Gemara says we learn from the altar, we learn something about Jewish people. Just like the altar had this very thin coating, especially the golden altar, because we know that gold is not the toughest necessarily of metals. And it was a very thin coating, and yet they burnt a fire on it every single day, and it never burnt through to the wood underneath. Says the Gemara, that teaches us that the Jewish people are like the altar. Just as the altar was never destroyed by the fire that burnt on it, the Jew can never be harmed by the fires of Gehenna. In other words, there is a process called Gehenna. There is a process that at a particular point in time, the neshama has to undergo some degree of cleansing to get rid of the impurities, but the fire doesn't burn us because the impurities are only a coating on the outside. It's appearances. Appearances are not who we are. Who we are, absolutely connected and committed to Hashem in spite of our sometimes wayward behavior. Now that teaches us an incredible lesson in how we're supposed to look at other people. If we were living in the time of Mashiach, then we could afford to take the Beis Shammai approach, which is see it as it meets the eye. And if a person is not exactly up to scratch, well, then you could be critical of them. Because in the context of Mashiach, we expect that people will live their truth. But for now, in the Beis Hillel reality that we're living in, which is the pre-Messianic age, we have to acknowledge that if we're not seeing the good in the next person, then we haven't looked hard enough. Then we haven't brought out the candle, Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam. The candle of Hashem is the soul of man. We're not looking through the lens of our neshama. We're looking through the lens of the physical eye, which is very often misleading. Because Hashem sees value in that person. Not just because Hashem created this person, which already tells you that they have value, but because Hashem chose that person as his so-called bride. That Jew who drives me nuts, who always picks out issues, who seems to completely reject the whole of Judaism, who gives us all a bad name. Hashem chose that person as his bride. So I have to use the Hillel method, which is look deeper, look at context. Keep looking, keep shining that light until I find that goodness in the next person. Because that's really what Hashem expects of me. And as we very well know, Hashem looks at us in a very similar way to how we look at others. And needless to say, we'd want Hashem, obviously, to see the goodness within us. So therefore, we need to look for the goodness within others, not because we're trying to be nice, not because we're trying to placate, not because we're trying to kiss up to them, but because we genuinely understand that they have absolute goodness. How do I know? Kala no'a v'chasuda, because they are Hashem's bride, who he chose as his special people. And there's no way that Hashem would have chosen a bride unless that bride was the best that there could possibly be. It's a very, very valuable lesson to consider in terms of our interpersonal relationships.